Baldwin I captured Constantinople in a shocking betrayal during the Fourth Crusade. What followed was not a single conquest, but a cascading collapse of legitimacy. One throne replaced by another, oaths rewritten in sealed letters, and emperors made in exile because the old capital had become a prize to be auctioned. The Crusaders arrived claiming salvation and left behind a new empire built on debt and broken alliances. The Byzantines scattered, forced to decide which claimant could still speak for Rome in the vacuum. Ambitious men discovered that the fastest path to power was to weaponize faith, marriage, and fear, until the city that had anchored an entire world order became a hostage of competing restorations. And when Constantinople finally returned to Byzantine hands, it would be reclaimed by a man whose survival depended on making treason look like necessity. The decision that detonated everything was made before the walls were even breached in 1204. The leaders of the Fourth Crusade stood bound to Venice by contracts and shortages, money owed, ships promised, soldiers impatient. In councils where the oath to liberate Jerusalem competed with the arithmetic of unpaid transport, Venice's Doge, Enrico Dandolo, offered a path out: redirect the crusade toward Constantinople, where a dethroned prince promised gold and submission to Rome. It was not simply greed. It was a choice shaped by structural constraint, an expedition that could not pay for itself, and a maritime republic that could enforce its will by controlling the sea lanes. When Constantinople fell, Baldwin of Flanders did not inherit an empire. He seized a wounded symbol. The Latin Empire was proclaimed with a public acclamation that tried to turn plunder into legitimacy. A crown on Baldwin's head could not repair what the sack announced. The old imperial order was now divisible property. The new regime's first survival problem was immediate: how to keep Crusader barons loyal when their reward was land that still had to be conquered, and how to rule a Greek population that now measured the Latins by the violence of their entry. The betrayal cut both ways. Byzantine aristocrats, who had maneuvered to use the Crusaders against rivals, watched the city slip from their control. Their risk was existential. Without Constantinople, emperor became a claim anyone could make, with enough soldiers and a priest willing to anoint them. In backroom negotiations and hurried flights, the imperial class, scattered to whatever stronghold, could still mint coins and command troops. Out of the ruins came a strategic truth: whoever could build an administrative center fast enough would become the memory of Byzantium. Baldwin tried to make the Latin Empire real by distributing fiefs and demanding obedience, but every act of allocation created enemies. Venetian privileges turned the port and trade into an island of foreign law. Frankish lords carved territories as if Byzantium were an empty map. Each concession purchased short-term loyalty and guaranteed long-term fragmentation. And to the north, Bulgaria's Tsar Kaloyan watched a new Latin regime overextend into Thrace, an invader that needed victories to justify itself. The crisis arrived in 1205 at Adrianople, where Baldwin faced a forced decision: retreat and admit weakness, or fight and risk the army that held his throne together. He chose battle. The consequence was catastrophic. The Latin host broke. Baldwin was captured. The emperor who had taken Constantinople became a political hostage, proof to the region that the new empire could be decapitated. His abrupt disappearance wasn't only a personal end, it was a legitimacy event. The Latin Empire would spend its entire life trying to compensate for that weakness with castles, treaties, and pleas to the west. While the Latins tried to govern a city they had traumatized, a different kind of empire began in exile. Theodore I Laskaris, connected to the old Komnenian networks by marriage and patronage, did not have Constantinople. But he had something the Latins lacked: a Greek administrative class looking for a safe master. In 1204, he fled across the straits and anchored himself at Nicaea, close enough to threaten the capital, far enough to survive. His first problem was not war, it was recognition. Without coronation and without the great city, he had to persuade soldiers and bishops that Byzantium still existed wherever he stood. Theodore's decisive move was to rebuild the scaffolding of legitimacy: court offices, a functioning treasury, and, most importantly, the church. With Constantinople occupied, The patriarchate's continuity became a weapon. Installing a patriarch in exile turned Nicaea into more than a refugee camp. It became a competing Rome. Every document sealed at Nicaea, every land grant and tax exemption was a signal to wavering elites that there was still a lawful order to serve. If they switched sides now, they might keep what they owned later. But exile also meant permanent pressure. The Latins held the symbolic center. Rival Greek rulers in Epirus and Trebizond claimed their own imperial futures. Theodore faced a constraint that no battlefield could solve: division among those who all said they were Byzantines. His survival required a delicate balance. Fight the Latins enough to stay credible, but not bleed so much that internal rivals could present themselves as the stronger protector. By 1205, he was crowned emperor. And in that act, the Byzantine world quietly accepted a new reality. Restoration would be slow, and it would begin away from the city that defined it. That fragmentation produced its own temptations. Theodore Komnenos Doukas, rising in the western Greek lands, saw in Thessalonica an opportunity to shortcut the long road Nicaea had chosen. When he captured the city in 1224, it was not just a conquest. It was a claim. Thessalonica was the second city of the Old Empire, a place where an emperor could be proclaimed in public and be heard across the Balkans. Theodore's gamble was that possession of a major urban center could outrank the patient legitimacy Nicaea had been constructing. He declared himself emperor, forcing every Byzantine loyalist into a decision they could not avoid. Which emperor was real? The one closest to Constantinople, or the one holding the Balkans' greatest prize? The structural force behind his ambition was time. The longer the Latins remained in Constantinople, the more permanent they would become. Theodore tried to accelerate history, push east, crowd Nicaea, and present the West with a single Greek rival. Then came the reversal that exposed the weakness of improvised empire. In 1230, Theodore marched against Bulgaria, seeking to remove a rival and expand his claim. The campaign ended in disaster at Klokotnitsa. Theodore was defeated and captured. Like Baldwin before him, he discovered that imperial titles do not protect a man in chains. His captivity collapsed his political project, and with it the illusion that a quick seizure of cities could replace durable institutions. That failure strengthened the exiled state that had played the longer game. John III Doukas Vatatzes, who became emperor at Nicaea in 1222, ruled like a man who understood that restoration was a logistics problem as much as a military one. His threat was twofold. Latin power still sat in Constantinople, and rival Greek courts still competed for recognition. His risk was that any single defeat could trigger elite defection. So John built resilience, taxation that could sustain armies, land policies that rewarded service, and diplomacy that turned enemies into temporary partners. John's decisive actions often took place not on battlefields but in negotiations, where marriage and treaties replaced sieges. Each agreement with a Balkan ruler or an Italian city-state was a calculated reduction of fronts. When he did fight the Latins, the goal was not heroic assault on Constantinople, but incremental strangulation. Taking fortresses, cutting roads, forcing the Latin rulers to beg for Western aid that arrived late or not at all. The consequence was gradual but relentless. The Latin Empire shrank into a capital with fewer resources than its symbolism demanded. Yet, John's strategy carried its own crises. Western emperors and popes could still mobilize coalitions. Internal aristocrats could still resent a strong central hand. Even success created fear among his own magnates. A restored Constantinople might mean audits, confiscations, and the return of officials who remembered old debts. John managed that anxiety by ensuring that victory looked profitable for those who supported it. Under his reign, Nicaea became not merely a placeholder but a state capable of reclaiming an empire. When John died, the structure he built produced a new kind of contender, Michael Palaiologos. Michael was not simply a general, he was a political animal formed in a court where every faction measured survival in days, not generations. By the late 1250s, the Nicene state was close to its goal, but that closeness increased danger. The closer Constantinople came, the higher the stakes of succession, and the more incentive rivals had to strike first. The crisis that elevated Michael began with a child, John IV Laskaris. The young heir represented lawful continuity. He also represented vulnerability. Regents and ministers controlled the state in his name, which meant that anyone who could seize the regency could command the army, the treasury, and the restoration project itself. Michael maneuvered through accusations, arrests, and shifting councils until, in 1259, he was elevated as co-emperor. The ceremony was a public transaction, a crown granted in exchange for protection. Everyone present understood the unstated threat. If Constantinople was to be taken, it would be taken by a man who could force obedience now. Michael's first forced decision was to secure the frontier that could block the road to the capital. At Pelagonia in 1259, he faced a coalition of Epirus and Latin allies. Victory there was not merely tactical, it was reputational. If he lost, he would be a co-emperor associated with failure, and the court would look for another strongman. If he won, he could claim that Providence, always useful to fragile rulers, favored his leadership. He won, and the consequence was immediate. Rivals in the Greek West splintered, and the path toward Constantinople looked less like a dream and more like a schedule, but Constantinople itself remained a trap. Assaulting the Theodosian walls head-on risked the kind of failure that destroys dynasties. Michael's constraint was resources. Nicaea could not afford endless siege while enemies gathered. So he pursued the kind of strategy that rewards nerve and punishes hesitation, intelligence, opportunism, and a willingness to let chance do what armies could not. In July 1261, that chance arrived in the form of a small unit and an open gate. Alexios Strategopoulos, sent on reconnaissance with a limited force, learned that the Latin garrison and Venetian fleet were away on a raid. The decision was immediate and irreversible. Wait for orders and risk the Latins returning, or gamble everything on a sudden entry that could either restore an empire or annihilate the raiding party. Strategopoulos chose the gamble. A night infiltration through a gate, reportedly the Cercoporta, became the hinge of sentries. The Latin defenders were caught off balance. The city changed hands with a speed that made it feel like fate. When Michael entered Constantinople, he did not arrive as a liberator to a unified people. He arrived as a claimant who needed to convert a military fait accompli into uncontested authority. The first public acts mattered because they were signals. Processions, proclamations, the reinstallation of imperial ceremony in Hagia Sophia. These weren't decorative rituals. They were tools to force bureaucrats, clergy, and the populace to behave as if the old empire had returned. Because once enough people behaved that way, it became harder to reverse. Then Michael made the decision that would haunt his name. He neutralized the child Emperor John IV. The boy was blinded and removed from power, a brutal Byzantine method of making a rival ineligible to rule. The risk Michael feared was clear. John IV's legitimacy could become a rallying point for conspirators, especially among aristocrats resentful of the Palaiologos rise. The consequence was also clear. Restoration now carried a stain, and Michael's dynasty would be seen by some as born in sacrilege. Here, the history turns contested, and the argument matters because it shaped later resistance. One interpretation treats Michael's move as cold necessity. An empire reclaimed by a coup could be lost by a counter-coup, and a living, legitimate heir is an invitation to civil war. Another interpretation treats it as an avoidable crime. Michael had already succeeded militarily and could have ruled as protector without mutilating a child, but chose violence to eliminate uncertainty. What is not contested is the result. Internal trust was damaged at the moment. Unity mattered most. The restored empire was also structurally weaker than the one that fell in 1204. Constantinople's economy had been siphoned. Territories were fragmented. Rivals remained entrenched. Michael's next crisis was external. The West did not accept the reversal as final. A Latin emperor in exile, Venetian commercial interests, and ambitious rulers like Charles of Anjou all had reasons to reconquer the city. The risk was existential. A single successful Western expedition could repeat 1204, and, this time, there might be no Nicaea left to retreat to. Michael's defensive strategy forced another legitimacy gamble: religion as diplomacy. To blunt papal support for a new crusade against Constantinople, he pursued union with Rome, culminating in the Council of Lyons in 1274. The decision was transactional, concede theological language and obedience in exchange for political breathing room. But the constraint was internal. Much of the Byzantine clergy and populace saw union as betrayal of orthodoxy. a surrender purchased with words that threatened the soul of the empire. The consequence was a state fighting on two fronts, one spiritual and one military. Michael suppressed anti-union opposition, using arrests and punishments to demonstrate that imperial policy would not be vetoed by monks or crowds. Each crackdown protected him from immediate Western invasion but deepened internal alienation. He was rebuilding an empire while simultaneously teaching many of his subjects to distrust the restorer, and yet the restoration held. The Latin Empire was finished. Constantinople was again the center from which titles and taxes could radiate. Michael reshaped the Byzantine system into a Palaiologan order, more dependent on diplomacy, more brittle economically, and increasingly forced to choose which frontiers to abandon to defend the capital. The empire that returned in 1261 was real, but it was not the old machine. It was a scarred state that had learned how quickly civilization can be repossessed. Michael VIII Palaiologos died having achieved the impossible and paid for it in the currency. Byzantium always demanded legitimacy. He restored Constantinople, but to keep it, he widened the gap between ruler and ruled, bargaining with Rome abroad while coercing dissent at home. Over the long term, the behavior of the system changed. Emperors after him relied even more on diplomacy, dynastic maneuver, and selective repression, tools suited to survival when resources are thin and enemies many. His legacy remains contested because it captures Byzantium's final paradox: a civilization saved by a man willing to break its moral expectations, and an empire restored to its capital only by proving that the capital itself could never again guarantee security.